African slaves stolen and enslaved. For over 400 years, millions of Africans were stolen from their homes and brought to the Americas as slaves. They were forced to work long hours in brutal conditions, separated from their families, and stripped of their freedom, dignity, and humanity. This dark chapter in our history must never be forgotten. Let us remember the atrocities committed against our ancestors and continue to fight for justice and equality for all people of color. Dred Scott, no rights that white people must respect. In 1857, Dred Scott, an enslaved African American, went to court to fight for his freedom. He argued that his time spent in free territories made him a free man. But the Supreme Court's decision declared that he and all African Americans had no rights that white people were bound to respect. This ruling set the stage for the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery, but the fight for full equality and justice for African Americans continues to this day. Let us never forget the legacy of Dred Scott and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Reconstruction era, civil rights taken away. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction era saw significant progress in African American rights, including the right to vote and hold office. But the rise of white supremacy and the dismantling of Reconstruction led to the taking away of these hard-won rights and the establishment of Jim Crow segregation laws. This period of history reminds us of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and the importance of never taking our progress for granted. Jim Crow, racial segregation and discrimination. Jim Crow laws institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination in the South from the late 1800s to the mid-1960s. African Americans were treated as second-class citizens, with separate and unequal facilities, from water fountains to schools. The legacy of Jim Crow continues to affect communities of color today, through systemic racism and unequal treatment under the law. Let us never forget the horrors of Jim Crow and work towards a future of true equality and justice for all. Lynched, extrajudicial killing of African Americans. Lynching was a brutal and violent act of terror used to control and intimidate African Americans from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. Thousands of innocent African Americans were lynched without due process, often for baseless allegations or simply for being black. The legacy of lynching continues to impact communities of color today, through racial profiling, police brutality, and unequal treatment under the law. Let us remember the victims of this horrific practice and work towards a future free from racial violence and injustice. Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Deliberate Neglect. From 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study intentionally left African American men with syphilis untreated, even as treatments became available. This unethical and racist study violated the basic principles of medical ethics and caused significant harm to the study participants and their families. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for health justice and the importance of ensuring that all medical research is conducted with respect for human rights and dignity. Emmett Till, lynched for whistling. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African American boy who was lynched in 1955 after whistling at a white woman. His brutal murder and the acquittal of his killer shocked the nation and helped spark the civil rights movement. Emmett Till's death serves as a powerful reminder of the racial violence and injustice that existed and continues to exist in America, and the importance of never forgetting the sacrifices made in the fight for racial justice. Let us honor Emmett Till's memory and work towards a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect. The Civil Rights Movement, a fight for freedom and equality. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was a pivotal moment in American history, as African Americans and their allies fought for freedom, equality, and justice. Through acts of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience, the movement challenged the entrenched systems of racial segregation and discrimination. The civil rights movement inspired a generation to continue the fight for justice and equality, and its legacy lives on today as we continue to work towards a more equitable and just society. The Black Power movement, empowerment and resistance. The Black Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s was a call for self-determination and empowerment for African Americans. The movement rejected the notion of integration into a white-dominated society and instead sought to create separate, autonomous Black communities. The Black Power movement challenged the systemic racism and oppression that existed and continues to exist in America, and its legacy lives on today as we work towards a more just and equitable society for all people of color. Fred Hampton murdered while sleeping. Fred Hampton was a charismatic and powerful leader of the Black Panther Party, working towards a more just and equitable society for African Americans. In 1969, he was murdered in his sleep in a police raid, in what was widely seen as an assassination. Fred Hampton's death serves as a stark reminder of the systemic violence and injustice faced by activists and communities of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for justice and equality. The war on drugs, disproportionate impact on communities of color. The war on drugs of the 1980s and 1990s had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, with African Americans and other people of color being arrested and incarcerated at higher rates than white people for drug offenses, despite similar rates of drug use. This systemic racism and bias in the criminal justice system continues to impact communities of color today, perpetuating the cycle of poverty, inequality, and mass incarceration. Let us remember the impact of the war on drugs and work towards a more just and equitable criminal justice system for all. Trayvon Martin, unarmed and killed. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old African American boy who was unarmed and killed by a neighborhood watch volunteer in 2012. His death and the subsequent acquittal of his killer sparked national protests and a renewed focus on racial profiling, police brutality, and the unequal treatment of people of color under the law. Trayvon Martin's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color. Michael Brown, another unarmed and murdered victim. Michael Brown was an 18-year-old African American man who was unarmed and shot by a police officer in 2014. His death and the subsequent protests in Ferguson, Missouri, brought national attention to the systemic violence and racism faced by communities of color, particularly by the police. Michael Brown's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. Eric Garner, choked to death on camera. Eric Garner was a 43-year-old African American man who was choked to death by a police officer in 2014. His death, captured on video and seen by millions, sparked national protests and a renewed focus on police brutality and the unequal treatment of people of color under the law. Eric Garner's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just, equitable society. Tamir Rice, a child with a toy gun. Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old African American boy who was shot and killed by a police officer in 2014 while playing with a toy gun in a park. His death, captured on video and seen by millions, sparked national protests and a renewed focus on police brutality and the unequal treatment of people of color, especially children, under the law. Tamir Rice's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. Philando Castile, shot during a traffic stop. Philando Castile was a 32-year-old African American man who was shot and killed by a police officer during a traffic stop in 2016. His death, captured on video and seen by millions, sparked national protests and a renewed focus on police brutality and the unequal treatment of people of color under the law. Philando Castile's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. Sandra Bland, found dead in a jail cell. Sandra Bland was a 28-year-old African American woman who was found dead in a jail cell in 2015, 3 days after being arrested during a routine traffic stop. Her death was ruled a suicide, but many believe that she was the victim of police brutality and mistreatment. Sandra Bland's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. The New Jim Crow, mass incarceration of communities of color. The New Jim Crow refers to the systemic racial bias and discrimination in the criminal justice system that has led to the mass incarceration of communities of color, particularly African Americans. The new Jim Crow perpetuates a cycle of poverty, inequality, and institutionalized racism, and serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. Breonna Taylor murdered while sleeping. Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old African American woman who was shot and killed by police in her own home in 2020 while she was sleeping. Her death, and the subsequent lack of accountability for the officers involved, sparked national protests and a renewed focus on police brutality and the unequal treatment of people of color under the law. Breonna Taylor's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. George Floyd, killed by police brutality. George Floyd was a 46-year-old African American man who was killed by a police officer in 2020, in a brutal act of police brutality that was captured on video and seen by millions. His death, and the subsequent protests and activism, sparked a national and global movement for racial justice and equality, with millions taking to the streets to demand change. George Floyd's death serves as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for African Americans and all people of color, and the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. It highlights the need for systemic change in the criminal justice system, to ensure that all people are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race. These 20 examples of racial injustice towards African Americans serve as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. They also remind us of the importance of never forgetting their sacrifices and continuing the fight for a more just and equitable society. By raising awareness and advocating for change, we can help to create a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race.